Settle yourself, if you would. Draw your covers close and still your restless mind. For tonight we delve into a history older than memory, darker than shadows, and more profound than the deepest dungeons of the very castle we shall explore. I speak, naturally, of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. You may think you know this place, this institution carved from Scottish stone and ancient magic. You would be mistaken. What you know are fragments, whispers, the sanitized tales deemed suitable for young minds still clutching their wands with uncertain fingers. Tonight I shall illuminate the complete chronicle, from its founding in an age of ignorance and fear, through centuries of triumph and tragedy, to its present form. Pay attention. I shall not repeat myself. Chapter 1. The Founder's Vision. An Age of Necessity. Cast your mind back, if your imagination permits, to the 10th century. A brutal time. A time when magic was not celebrated but hunted, when those born with power in their veins were forced into shadows and secrecy. The persecution of magical folk had reached such heights that survival itself hung by the most tenuous of threads. Witch burnings plagued the continent. The ignorant masses, armed with torches and terror, sought to extinguish what they could not comprehend. Most wizards and witches who fell to such mobs were fools who had neglected to master even the simplest flame-freezing charm. But that is beside the point. The point is that magical children grew up isolated, untrained, their abilities manifesting in dangerous and unpredictable ways. Without instruction, without discipline, young magical folk posed threats to themselves, and perhaps more critically, to the secrecy upon which the magical community's survival depended. Into this chaos stepped 4 of the most powerful magical practitioners of their age. They were not friends, not initially. They were brought together by necessity, by the shared recognition that something must be done, that the future of magic itself hung in precarious balance. Godric, Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin. 4 distinct personalities, 4 divergent philosophies, united by a singular purpose, the education and preservation of magical youth. They sought a location remote enough to escape Muggle notice, yet accessible to those who would need it. The Scottish Highlands provided ideal isolation, a landscape of mist-shrouded peaks and dark lochs where magic ran deep through the very earth. Here they would construct not merely a school, but a fortress, a haven, a monument to magical learning that would endure for 1,000 years and beyond. Their vision was ambitious to the point of audacity. They would create a curriculum encompassing every branch of magical knowledge. They would gather the young from across Britain and beyond, training them in the precise application of magic, instilling discipline, revealing the depths of magical theory and practice. They would build something permanent, something that would outlast them all. And they succeeded, though the cost of that success would prove higher than any of them could have anticipated. Chapter 2. The 4 Founders, Architects of Legacy. To understand Hogwarts, one must first understand its creators, for their personalities, their conflicts, their very essences were woven into the stones of the castle itself. They were not the unified front that legend suggests. They were for individuals of formidable power and equally formidable pride. Godric Gryffindor, the warrior, a duelist without peer, he valued courage above all virtue. Bold to the point of recklessness, he believed that true worth was demonstrated through bravery in the face of adversity. His students would be the daring, the chivalrous, those willing to stand against darkness regardless of personal cost. He came from the West Country, from wild moorlands, where he had defended magical folk against those who would destroy them. His sword, imbued with such powerful enchantments that it could only be drawn by one truly worthy, became a symbol of his house. Gryffindor believed in action, in the immediate response to injustice. Subtlety was not his strength. He saw the world in terms of right and wrong, good and evil, with precious little grey between. Helga Hufflepuff, perhaps the most underestimated of the four, and therefore, perhaps, the most dangerous. Do not mistake her kindness for weakness. She valued loyalty, hard work, fair play, and patience. Where Gryffindor saw the exceptional Hufflepuff, saw potential in all. She believed that magical education should not be the province of the elite alone, that every magical child deserved the opportunity to learn, regardless of their background or apparent talent. She came from the valley of the same name, from fertile lands where she had developed unprecedented skill in plant-based magic and charms related to food and comfort. Her common room, located near the kitchens, reflected her practical nature. But understand this: Hufflepuff's inclusive philosophy was not weakness. It was radical. In an age when bloodlines and pedigree determined one's worth, she insisted that character mattered more than heritage. This put her in frequent conflict with Slytherin, as you might imagine. Rowena Ravenclaw, the intellectual architect, where others saw magic as a tool, she saw it as a subject for endless study, a puzzle to be solved, mysteries to be unraveled. She valued wit, wisdom, and learning above all else. Her students would be those who sought knowledge for its own sake, who understood that power without understanding was merely crude force. She came from the glens of Scotland, and her contributions to the castle's design were considerable. The ever-changing staircases, the numerous secret passages, the very structure of the castle that confounds logic and defies Muggle physics, these bear her mark. Ravenclaw was also the creator of the famous diadem, an object she believed would enhance the wisdom of its wearer. That this object would later become an instrument of unimaginable evil is one of history's crueler ironies. She was perhaps the most private of the four, keeping her own counsel, and her departure from the castle late in her life remains shrouded in tragedy and mystery. And then Salazar Slytherin, my own house founder, and therefore the one about whom I shall endeavor to be particularly objective, though I suspect you would appreciate nothing less. Slytherin was cunning, ambitious, and resourceful. He valued pure-blood heritage, believing that magical ability flowed most strongly through ancient wizarding lines. This was not mere prejudice, though it was certainly that as well, but a philosophy born from observation and perhaps fear. He had witnessed too many Muggle-born wizards who lacked the cultural context to understand the importance of secrecy, who endangered the entire magical community through ignorance or sentimentality toward their non-magical relatives. He came from the Fens, from dark waterlands, where serpents were sacred and Parseltang was spoken. His contributions to the castle included many of its defensive enchantments and, of course, the Chamber of Secrets. Though we shall address that particular piece of architectural lunacy in due course. These four brought their students together not in a single mass, but divided them into houses bearing their names. Each house would reflect its founder's values, creating a system of competition and camaraderie that persists to this day. It was an elegant solution, or so it seemed. In practice, it created divisions that would echo through centuries, fostering rivalries that occasionally spilled into genuine enmity. Chapter 3: Construction and the Castle's Magic. The construction of Hogwarts was not accomplished through conventional means. You will not find records of stonemasons laboring for decades, nor architects drawing plans on parchment. The castle was raised through magic of a kind that is scarcely practiced today. Collaborative enchantment on a scale that required all four founders working in concert. They drew upon the magic of the land itself, the ancient power that flowed through the Scottish Highlands like blood through veins. The castle grew from the ground, stone shaping itself according to their combined will. Towers spiraled upward, dungeons delved deep into bedrock, passages twisted and wound through impossible geometries. The great hall with its enchanted ceiling, reflecting the sky above, regardless of weather or time. The house common rooms, each hidden and protected, accessible only to those who belonged. The library, already ancient when it was built, its shelves eager for the grimoires and texts that would fill them. The hospital wing, the kitchens served by house elves bound to the castle through magic older than the founders themselves. Every stone was placed with purpose, every enchantment layered with care. But the castle was more than mere architecture. The founders imbued it with protective magic of staggering complexity, anti-apparition wards that made it impossible to appear or disappear within the grounds without permission, concealment charms that rendered it invisible to Muggle eyes, appearing only as a dangerous ruin should any non-magical person wander too close. Defensive enchantments that could repel armies, that could transform the very structure into a weapon should the need arise. These protections were designed to last not years but centuries, to adapt and strengthen with time rather than fade. The castle possessed, from its very inception, a kind of consciousness, not sentience, precisely, but awareness. The staircases that moved of their own accord, the doors that appeared only to those who needed them. The room of requirement that manifested in response to genuine need. These were not merely clever charms, but evidence of something deeper. The castle itself was alive in its way, responsive to the magic and emotions of those who dwelled within its walls. It remembered, it watched, and occasionally it acted. The first students arrived in autumn, as they do still. Children torn between terror and wonder, clutching their wands and their meager possessions, staring up at towers that pierced the Scottish mists like stone needles. They were sorted into houses through methods that remain, even now, somewhat mysterious. The sorting hat, Gryffindor's hat, actually, into which all 4 founders placed their knowledge and judgment, would peer into the minds of 11-year-olds and divine where they belong. An intimate violation, some might call it. Unnecessary categorization, others would argue. Regardless, it worked after its fashion. The curriculum in those early years was less structured than what exists today. Students learned defense against the dark arts from Gryffindor himself, though what precisely constituted dark arts in the 10th century was considerably more flexible than modern definitions might allow. Slytherin taught potions and what we would now call the dark arts without the euphemistic defense against qualifier. Ravenclaw instructed in charms and transfiguration, pushing her students to understand the theoretical underpinnings of every spell. Hufflepuff taught herbology and what might generously be termed practical magic, the spells and charms necessary for daily life, agriculture, healing, household magic that more ambitious wizards dismissed as beneath their notice. There were no house points in those early years, no Quidditch to distract students from their studies. Education was serious, dangerous work. Mistakes in transfiguration could be lethal. Improperly brewed potions could maim or kill. The castle itself posed constant hazards to the unwary. Students learned quickly, or they did not survive to graduate. It was a harder time, a more brutal time, and perhaps because of that, or perhaps despite it, those early students emerged as some of the most powerful witches and wizards of their age. Chapter 4. The Slytherin Schism. Paradise Lost. But paradise, such as it was, could not last. The tensions between Slytherin and the other founders, simmering from the beginning, eventually reached a boiling point. The conflict centered, publicly at least, on the question of blood status. Slytherin grew increasingly vocal in his opposition to teaching Muggle-born students. He argued that they were security risks, that their loyalties would forever be divided between the magical world and the Muggle families they left behind. He pointed to instances where Muggle-born students had inadvertently revealed magical secrets to non-magical relatives, endangering the statute of secrecy before such a statute formally existed. The other 3 founders disagreed, with varying degrees of Gryffindor, predictably, found Slytherin's position cowardly and unjust. Hufflepuff considered it a betrayal of the school's fundamental purpose. Ravenclaw, typically more measured, nonetheless concluded that excluding students based on parentage rather than ability was intellectually indefensible. The arguments grew heated, then hostile. Staff meetings devolved into shouting matches. Students began choosing sides. Houses that had once competed amicably now viewed each other with suspicion and contempt. Slytherin, sensing he was outnumbered and that his vision for the school would not prevail, made a decision that would reverberate through history. In secret, deep beneath the castle, using his abilities as a parcel-mouth and his considerable skill in magical architecture, he constructed the Chamber of Secrets. Within this chamber, he placed a basilisk, a serpent of monstrous proportions whose gaze could kill with a single glance. He bound it with magic to to respond only to his heir, to one who spoke Parseltang as he did, and he left instructions, either written or encoded in the very spells that sealed the chamber, that his heir should open the chamber and cleanse the school of those unworthy to study magic. When this betrayal was discovered, or perhaps when Slytherin himself revealed it in a final, dramatic confrontation, the break became irrevocable. Slytherin left Hogwarts, never to return. He vanished from historical record shortly thereafter, his fate unknown. Some say he lived out his days in isolation, bitter and alone. Others claim he founded another school, though no evidence of such an institution has ever been found. What is certain is that his departure wounded the school deeply. The four-part vision became three. The house that bore his name continued, taught by other instructors, but it carried the taint of its founder's abandonment. The Chamber of Secrets itself became legend, then myth, then a story to frighten first years. Centuries passed with no sign of the basilisk, no heir arising to fulfill Slytherin's grim prophecy. The chamber's location was forgotten. Headmasters and headmistresses searched, some briefly, others obsessively, but the castle kept its secret, and the basilisk slept on, waiting in the darkness far below. A time bomb ticking toward a future none could predict. The psychological impact on the remaining founders cannot be understated. They had poured years of their lives into this joint enterprise, only to see it shattered by philosophical differences and personal animosity. Gryffindor grew more militant in his opposition to dark magic, seeing threats where perhaps none existed. Hufflepuff retreated into her work, finding solace in teaching and the quiet satisfaction of helping individual students. Ravenclaw became more withdrawn, spending long hours in her tower, speaking less in council meetings, her brilliant mind turning inward. Chapter 5. Medieval Centuries. Growth through Adversity. Following Slytherin's departure, Hogwarts entered what historians refer to as its consolidation period. The three remaining founders eventually passed, as all witches and wizards must, though not before establishing systems and traditions designed to outlast them. They appointed successors, witches and wizards of power and learning who would continue their work. The transition was not seamless. There were disputes over who should lead, what the school's priority should be, how to handle the fact that 1/4 of the school's students belonged to a house whose founder had explicitly betrayed the institution. But the school endured. New headmasters and headmistresses took the role, each leaving their mark. Everhard the Elder, who served in the 13th century, established the first formal curriculum, standardizing what had previously been somewhat haphazard instruction. Philida Spore revolutionized the teaching of herbology in the 1400s, introducing species from the Far East and establishing greenhouses that could sustain even the most exotic magical plants in the harsh Scottish climate. Dilys Derwent, who would later serve as healer at St. Mungo's, reformed the hospital wing and established protocols for treating magical maladies that are still referenced today. The medieval period also saw Hogwarts face external threats that tested its defenses and the resolve of its inhabitants. The witch hunts that swept across Europe did not spare Britain. Though most magical folk were able to protect themselves again, flame-freezing charms rendered burning at the stake merely uncomfortable rather than lethal. The constant persecution created an atmosphere of siege. Hogwarts became more than a school during these dark years. It became a refuge, a fortress, where magical families sent their children not only to learn, but to survive. The castle's defenses were tested repeatedly. Muggle mobs occasionally discovered the general location of the school, though the concealment charms prevented them from seeing anything more than ruins. More dangerous were the witch hunters, who possessed enough magical sensitivity to penetrate some of the lesser enchantments. These had to be dealt with through memory charms and, when necessary, more permanent solutions. The details of such incidents are not recorded in any history book you will find in the library, but they occurred nonetheless. War, even defensive war, requires choices that do not bear close examination in peacetime. Within the castle walls, the house system solidified into something resembling its modern form. Quidditch emerged in the 11th century, initially as a rather crude and dangerous sport played on basic broomsticks. It evolved rapidly, becoming the obsession that has distracted countless students from their studies ever since. House rivalries intensified, occasionally spilling into genuine violence. Several headmasters attempted to eliminate the house system entirely, arguing that it created more problems than it solved. These efforts failed, resisted by students, staff, and the castle itself, which seemed to prefer its inhabitants, divided into 4 camps. The library grew, its shelves expanding through magic and careful acquisition. Rare texts were donated by graduating students or purchased from the estates of deceased wizards. The restricted section emerged as certain books proved too dangerous for general access grimoires that could drive readers mad. Texts on dark magic so detailed that merely reading them constituted a form of corruption. Theoretical works on magic so advanced that attempting to practice the spells described within could tear holes in reality itself. These were locked away, accessible only with permission and under supervision, though naturally this restriction merely made them more desirable to certain students. Chapter 6. The Tournament Years. Glory and Tragedy. In 1318, the Triwizard Tournament was established. It was conceived as a means of fostering international magical cooperation, a competition between the 3 largest European wizarding schools, Hogwarts, Boxbatons, and Durmstrang. Students would compete in 3 tasks designed to test their magical prowess, their courage, and their intelligence. The winner would receive eternal glory, 1,000 galleons, and the Triwizard Cup itself, a goblet that became a symbol of magical excellence. The tournament was held every 5 years, rotating between the 3 schools. When Hogwarts hosted, the castle transformed into something resembling a medieval fair. Delegations from France and from the far north arrived in styled Boxbatons in their powder-blue robes, Durmstrang in their blood-red, both groups eyeing each other and the Hogwarts students with competitive suspicion. The tasks varied from tournament to tournament, but they shared certain characteristics. They were dangerous, They were designed to be spectacular, and they occasionally resulted in death. Students perished, not frequently, but regularly enough that after several centuries, the death toll became impossible to ignore. A Boksbatten's champion gored by a magically enhanced beast during a task involving creatures. A Durmstrang competitor drowned when an underwater challenge went catastrophically wrong. A Hogwarts student, dueling another champion, struck with a curse that no spell could reverse. The tournament continued despite these tragedies, or perhaps because of them danger, after all, was part of the appeal. The tournament reached its peak in the 1600s, when tasks became increasingly elaborate and hazardous. Dragons were involved in several tournaments, as were acromantulas, kelpies, and on one memorable occasion, a lethofold that nearly consumed all three champions before the judges intervened. The crowds loved it. The students lived for the chance to compete, even knowing the risks. Glory, in those days, was worth dying for. But the essentials are clear. A task went horrifically wrong. All three champions died, along with several judges and numerous spectators. The exact nature of what killed them is debated. Some sources suggest a cockatrice that broke free of its restraints. Others point to a spell that backfired with catastrophic magnitude. Regardless, the carnage was sufficient that the tournament was suspended indefinitely. Attempts were made over the subsequent centuries to revive it in safer form, but the magical governments of Britain, France, and whatever counted as government in the regions Durmstrang served, could never reach agreement on acceptable modifications. The tournament remained suspended, a relic of a more dangerous age, until but no, we are not yet at that point in our history. Patience. Chapter 7. Grindelwald's Shadow. The First Global War. The late 19th and early 20th centuries brought new challenges, as the magical world could not entirely insulate itself from the Muggle world's convulsions. But the truly significant threat came not from Muggles, but from within the magical community itself. Gellert Grindelwald rose to power in continental Europe, advocating for wizard supremacy, for an end to the Statute of Secrecy, for open domination of non-magical peoples for the greater good. His ideology found fertile ground among certain segments of the wizarding population. Those who chafed under the restrictions of secrecy, who believed their power entitled them to rule. Grindelwald gathered followers, established a power base, and began a campaign of terror and conquest that would engulf the magical world for decades. It was, in every meaningful sense, a war, though it remained hidden from Muggle awareness. Hogwarts during this period walked a delicate line. Britain had not yet committed to active opposition to Grindelwald that would come later, driven largely by the actions of one man. The castle became a refuge for students fleeing the continent, young witches and wizards whose families had run afoul of Grindelwald's forces. The classrooms held children who had witnessed horrors no child should see, who flinched at sudden movements, who woke screaming from nightmares. The staff, too, was divided. Some believed Britain should remain neutral, that involving the school in foreign conflicts was unwise. Others argued that neutrality in the face of such evil was itself evil, that Hogwarts had a moral obligation to oppose Grindelwald. These debates occurred in staff meetings and private conversations, never in front of students, but the tension was palpable. And then there was Albus Dumbledore, Professor of Transfiguration, Deputy Headmaster, widely acknowledged as one of the most brilliant magical minds of his generation. His relationship with Grindelwald was known to fewer, youthful friendship that had ended in tragedy and estrangement. For years Dumbledore refused to act against his former friend. Despite mounting pressure from the British ministry and from his colleagues at Hogwarts, his reasons were his own, buried beneath layers of guilt and old affection and pain. When Dumbledore finally confronted Grindelwald in 1945, the duel became instant legend. It lasted 3 hours. It destroyed much of the area where it occurred, and it ended with Grindelwald's defeat and imprisonment in his own fortress of Nurmengard. Dumbledore returned to Hogwarts changed, carrying a burden visible to those who knew him well. He had defeated the greatest dark wizard of the age, but the victory brought him no joy, only weary relief and enduring sorrow. Dumbledore was offered the position of Minister for Magic. He refused. Instead, he accepted the role of Headmaster of Hogwarts, a position he would hold for decades to come. Under his leadership, the school entered what many consider its golden age. Though such assessments depend heavily on perspective and what particular era one happened to inhabit the castle. Chapter 7. The Dark Lord's First Rise. War comes home. But Grindelwald's defeat did not usher in lasting peace. Within a generation, a new darkness emerged, this time from Britain itself. Tom Marvolo Riddle, who had walked these halls as a student in the 1930s and 40s, returned as Lord Voldemort, a name that would become synonymous with terror. His rise was gradual at first, then catastrophically swift. He gathered followers, Death Eaters, who shared his vision of pure blood supremacy, and his willingness to employ any means to achieve it. They attacked Muggleborns, blood traitors, anyone who opposed them. The Ministry of Magic proved ineffective, infiltrated by Voldemort's sympathizers and paralyzed by fear. The burden of resistance fell largely to a loose organization called the Order of the Phoenix, led by Dumbledore and operating from the shadows. Hogwarts, during the First Wizarding War, became a strange place, an island of relative normalcy in a world descending into chaos. Classes continued. Students worried about exams and Quidditch matches and typical adolescent dramas. But beneath the surface, tension ran like underground water. Students arrived each year fewer in number. Some families keeping their children home, others fled the country entirely. The Muggleborn students who did attend carried an extra weight, knowing they were primary targets. Several students from this era would become Death Eaters. You may wish to cover your ears at this point, but the truth is that Slytherin house, my house, produced more than its share of Voldemort's followers. This is not a coincidence. Voldemort deliberately cultivated students who displayed the cunning and ambition Slytherin valued, twisting those traits toward his own ends. He promised them power, status, A world where their heritage would be celebrated rather than merely tolerated. Some joined from genuine belief, others from fear. A few from simple ambition, seeing Voldemort's rise as inevitable and wishing to be on the winning side. But not all. Many Slytherins opposed him, though their opposition often took quieter forms than the open defiance favored by Gryffindor. Intelligence gathering, sabotage, protection of vulnerable individuals. These were the weapons of those who understood that sometimes the most effective resistance operates in shadow rather than light. These contributions have been largely forgotten or deliberately overlooked in the simplified narratives that followed the war. The war reached its climax in 1981, on Halloween night in the village of Godric's Hollow. Voldemort, hunting a prophecy, sought to kill an infant named Harry Potter. The specifics of that night have been recounted so often they have achieved the status of myth, but certain facts remain undisputed. Voldemort killed James and Lily Potter. He attempted to kill their son, and something went catastrophically wrong. The killing curse rebounded. Voldemort's body was destroyed. His soul fragment fled as a less-than-ghost. And the war ended not with a battle, but with a baby's survival. Hogwarts exhaled. The tension that had gripped it for over a decade dissipated like morning fog. Students celebrated, perhaps without fully understanding what they celebrated. The staff, who had lived through the war's darkest days, felt relief mingled with exhaustion and grief for all that had been lost. Dumbledore, who had made choices during the war that would haunt him until his death, resumed his role as headmaster of a school attempting to heal. Chapter 8. The Peaceful Years, Complacency and Calm. The decade that followed Voldemort's fall was, by all accounts, remarkably pleasant. The school settled back into routines that the war had disrupted. Quidditch became important again. Students worried about ordinary things, relationships, grades, career prospects. The staff could focus on teaching rather than wondering which students might become murderers and which might become victims. New professors joined the staff, including myself, in the autumn of 1981, though we need not dwell on that particular detail. The curriculum evolved, with less emphasis on defense against the dark arts, an ironic shift, given what was to command more focus on theoretical magic and academic excellence. The school's reputation, somewhat tarnished by the war years, began to recover. Parents felt comfortable sending their children again. Enrollment increased, but complacency is dangerous, particularly in the magical world, where threats rarely remain vanquished forever. There were signs, had anyone been paying sufficient attention, that Voldemort's defeat was not as permanent as the wizarding world wished to believe. Strange incidents occurred. A professor possessed in Harry Potter's first year. The Chamber of Secrets opened in his second. Dementors swarming the grounds in his third. Each crisis was resolved, but the pattern should have been obvious. Something was building. Darkness gathering strength for another assault. The castle itself seemed to sense this. The ghosts grew restless. The portraits muttered among themselves. The house elves, always sensitive to the castle's moods, became skittish. But humans, even magical ones, excel at ignoring warnings they find inconvenient. Chapter 9: The Second War. Darkness Returns. In the summer of 1995, Voldemort returned to corporeal form. The Ministry of Magic, under Cornelius Fudge's incompetent leadership, refused to acknowledge this reality. Dumbledore and those loyal to him found themselves fighting a war on two fronts against Voldemort's reconstituted Death Eater army, and against their own government's willful blindness. Hogwarts became a battleground, not of spells and curses, but of information and control. The Ministry appointed Dolores Umbridge as defense against the dark arts teacher and later High Inquisitor, giving her authority to reshape the school according to Ministry preferences. Her tenure was a masterclass in bureaucratic tyranny, educational decrees that stripped away student rights, teaching methods that rendered defense against the dark arts practically useless, a systematic attempt to discredit Dumbledore and anyone who supported him. Students responded by forming their own defense organization, led by young Potter, teaching each other practical defensive magic in secret. The irony of students being forced to teach themselves what the school should have been teaching them was apparently lost on the Ministry, though not on those of us who understood that Umbridge's true purpose was never education but control. The following year brought new horrors. Dumbledore died, murdered by circumstances that remain complex and painful to examine in detail. The headmaster who had led the school for decades, who had been its moral center, was gone. His death left a vacuum that was rapidly filled by forces far less benign. In the summer of 1997, Voldemort achieved effective control of magical Britain. The Ministry fell. Death Eaters assumed positions of power, and Hogwarts was handed to Severus Snape as headmaster, with Amicus and Alecto Carrow serving as his deputies. You might imagine this period would be one I would prefer not to discuss. You would be correct. But completeness demands we examine even the most uncomfortable truths. The school under Death Eater control was unrecognizable. Muggle studies became compulsory, taught by Alecto Carrow as a course in Muggle baiting and hatred. Defense against the dark arts, taught by Amicus, became instruction in the dark arts themselves, with students practicing unforgivable curses on those sent to detention. Punishments grew increasingly severe, often involving torture. Students from Muggle-born families were barred from attending entirely, hunted by snatchers, and dragged before the Muggle-born Registration Commission. And yet resistance persisted. Dumbledore's army reformed, conducting guerrilla operations within the castle itself. Neville Longbottom emerged as a leader, organizing students, protecting the vulnerable, openly defying the Carrows, despite the consequences. The Room of Requirement became a sanctuary for those fleeing punishment, a pocket dimension where students could hide and plan and maintain hope. The situation reached its culmination on the 2nd of May, 1998, the Battle of Hogwarts. Voldemort, having learned that Potter was seeking something within the castle, arrived with his entire army. What followed was the most devastating conflict the school had ever witnessed. The protective enchantments that had stood for 1,000 years were tested to their absolute limit. Statues animated to defend the castle. Suits of armor marched into battle. The very structure itself fought alongside its defenders. The castle suffered catastrophic damage. Walls crumbled under sustained magical assault. Entire corridors collapsed. The astronomy tower, where Dumbledore had fallen, was partially destroyed. The Great Hall, which had hosted a millennium of feasts and gatherings, became a field hospital and, eventually, a morgue. Students fought alongside professors, parents, members of the Order of the Phoenix. House elves emerged from the kitchens armed with knives. Portraits evacuated their frames or shouted warnings and encouragement to the combatants below. The death toll was staggering. Fred Weasley, Colin Creevey, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, Lavender Brown, these are merely the names recorded in official accounts. Dozens more fell, students and adults alike, their names carved into memorial stones that now stand in the grounds. The castle itself bled magic, its ancient enchantments damaged, its consciousness reeling from the violence conducted within its walls. And in the end, in the Great Hall with the battle raging around them, Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort faced each other one final time. The specifics of their final confrontation have been debated endlessly. What spells were cast, what words exchanged, how precisely Voldemort's own curse rebounded yet again to destroy him. What matters is the result. Voldemort died, truly and permanently this time, his soul too fractured and damaged to persist in any form. The war ended as dawn broke over the ruined castle, survivors stumbling through smoke and rubble, trying to process what they had endured and what had been lost. Chapter 10. Reconstruction. Building from ashes. The days immediately following the battle were chaotic. The castle was structurally unsound in several areas, requiring emergency stabilization charms to prevent further collapse. The dead had to be identified and mourned, the wounded treated, the traumatized comforted, as best anyone could manage. The ministry, purged of Voldemort's appointees, was barely functional. No one was certain who had authority to make decisions or how to proceed. Minerva McGonagall, as deputy headmistress and the senior surviving member of the staff, assumed control. Her first act was to cancel the remainder of the school year. Students who had participated in the battle were sent home to their families, or to whatever remained of their families. Many had lost parents, siblings, entire households during the war. Those whose homes were destroyed, or who had nowhere safe to go, were housed temporarily in undamaged portions of the castle. The rebuilding began immediately, driven by necessity as much as desire. The ministry provided funding, though nowhere near sufficient for the scale of damage. Private donations supplemented official support, alumni contributing what they could. Wealthy, pure-blood families attempting to rehabilitate their reputations by opening their vaults. The goblins of Gringotts, despite their general disdain for wizarding conflicts, provided low-interest loans for reconstruction, seeing it as sound investment in magical Britain's future. But repairing stone and wood was the simple part. The castle's magical infrastructure had been damaged in ways that were far more complex to address. The protective enchantments needed to be rewoven, a process requiring multiple skilled enchanters working in concert. The moving staircases had frozen in position or moved erratically. Several secret passages had collapsed entirely. The room of requirement, which had been set ablaze during the battle by Funfire, that consumed untold treasures and nearly killed those inside, was simply gone. Its entrance vanished. The room itself apparently destroyed beyond the castle's ability to repair. House elves worked tirelessly, as is their nature, clearing rubble and restoring the kitchens and common areas. The ghosts, who had witnessed the battle with horror violence on such a scale, had not occurred within these walls, since the castle's founding helped locate survivors trapped in collapsed sections and guided repair crews to areas requiring urgent attention. Even the portraits contributed, maintaining communication between different parts of the castle and preserving institutional memory about how things had been. Ensuring repairs maintained continuity with the past. The psychological reconstruction proved more challenging than the physical. Students who returned the following September walked through halls where they had watched friends die. They ate in a great hall where they had laid out bodies in neat rows. They studied defense against the dark arts in a classroom where torture had been taught. The castle held ghosts that were not spectral now, but memory, trauma imprinted on stone that remembered everything. McGonagall, elevated to headmistress, made several controversial decisions. She dissolved the Slytherin house temporarily, absorbing its students into the other 3 houses. This decision sparked intense debates. Some argued it was necessary given Slytherin's association with Death Eaters. Others claimed it punished students for their founders' choices and their housemates' crimes. The decision was reversed within 3 years. Slytherin reconstituted, but the controversy lingered. She also reformed the curriculum significantly. Defense against the dark arts became a more comprehensive course, focusing not merely on specific spells, but on recognizing and resisting magical manipulation. Understanding how decent people could be drawn into supporting atrocity, building mental fortitude alongside practical skills. History of magic, previously taught by the ghostly and monumentally boring Professor Binns, was restructured to examine magical history critically rather than as a series of goblin rebellions and meaningless dates. Perhaps most significantly, McGonagall instituted a new course, Muggle Studies, redesigned entirely from the farce it had become under Alecto Carrow. This became mandatory for all students, pureblood and half-blood alike, with curriculum designed to foster understanding and eliminate the ignorance that had enabled Voldemort's ideology to gain traction. The course examined Muggle technology, culture, history, and the ways magical and non-magical worlds intersected and influenced each other. Not everyone approved of these changes. Traditional families complained that Hogwarts was abandoning its heritage, that it was being transformed into something unrecognizable. Some withdrew their children, sending them to foreign schools or hiring private tutors. But most recognized that the old ways had led to disaster, that the school needed to evolve if it was to avoid repeating the catastrophes of the past. The castle itself seemed to recover more quickly than its human inhabitants. Within 5 years, the physical damage had been largely repaired. Though certain scars remained, deliberately preserved a section of wall left crumbled as memorial. Names carved into stone in the entrance hall, listing those who fell defending the school. The magic returned, the enchantments rewoven, the protective barriers restored, and in some cases strengthened, with modern additions. Chapter 11: The Modern Era. Hogwarts Transformed. Today, Hogwarts stands as something both ancient and new. The castle that greets first years arriving by boat across the Black Lake appears unchanged from the part structure that greeted students 1,000 years ago. The same towers pierced the sky. The same enchanted ceiling reflects the heavens in the great hall. The same staircases shift and move with mechanical or possibly malicious intent. But beneath this continuity, much has changed. The student body is more diverse than at any point in the school's history. Muggle-born students attend in numbers that would have horrified Salazar Slytherin, and perhaps made Helga Hufflepuff smile with satisfaction. International students, once rare, now constitute a significant minority, drawn by Hogwarts' reputation and the post-war reforms. The house system persists, but its rigid boundaries have softened into house cooperation is encouraged, rather than merely tolerated, and the toxic rivalries that once characterized relationships between houses have largely faded. The curriculum continues to evolve. Subjects dismissed as frivolous in earlier Erasmus studies, magical theory, ethics of magic now occupy equal status with traditional disciplines. Wandless magic, once considered an advanced skill taught only to exceptional students, is introduced in fourth year to all who show aptitude. The study of magical creatures has expanded dramatically, influenced heavily by the work of Newt Scamander and his successors, with students now routinely interacting with species that previous generations knew only from textbooks. Defense against the dark arts. That cursed position that once cycled through instructors with disturbing regularity finally achieved stability. The curse that Voldemort had placed on the position, preventing anyone from holding it for more than a year, died with him. Competent instructors can now build careers teaching defensive magic, developing curriculum that builds progressively across all 7 years, rather than starting from scratch each September. The castle's technology, if such a word can apply to an institution that eschews electricity, has also advanced. The Flu network connection has been expanded and secured with modern enchantments. Communication mirrors, once rare personal items, are now standard issue for prefects and staff. The library has been partially digitized, not with computers, obviously, but with magical equivalents that allow students to search the collection without physically traversing the stacks. Certain professors have grumbled that this encourages laziness, that students should develop the research skills that come from manual searching. These professors are old and will eventually retire. Perhaps most significantly, Hogwarts has opened its archives. For centuries, records of the school's history were accessible only to headmasters and selected scholars. Now, students in advanced history of magic courses can access primary sources, can read first-hand accounts of the school's founding, can examine the conflicts and controversies that shaped the institution. This transparency represents a fundamental shift in philosophy and acknowledgement that students deserve to understand the full complexity of the institution they inhabit, shadows and light together. The relationship between Hogwarts and the Ministry of Magic has also evolved. In the past, the school maintained fierce independence, resisting ministry interference, even when such interference might have been beneficial. The post-war era has seen greater cooperation, with the ministry providing funding and oversight while respecting the school's academic autonomy. This balance remains delicate, periodically threatened when ministers with authoritarian inclinations attempt to exert undue control. But thus far, the equilibrium has held. The faculty itself has changed. Professors who fought in the war, who watched students die, who made impossible choices under impossible circumstances, gradually retired or moved to other positions. Younger instructors arrived, trained in the post-war era, bringing fresh perspectives and modern pedagogical approaches. They face different challenges than their predecessors: how to teach students who have never known existential threat, how to ensure the lessons of the war remain vital, rather than becoming mere historical footnotes. The ghosts that haunt the castle have been joined by new shades. The Grey Lady, Helena Ravenclaw, seems somehow more present, perhaps freed by the destruction of the diadem that bound her to her guilt. The Bloody Baron remains as silent and somber as ever. Nearly Headless Nick continues to host his Death Day parties, now attended by younger ghosts who died in the battle, still processing their own deaths, still anchored to the castle by unfinished business or simple unwillingness to move on. Chapter 12. The Soul of the Castle. What endures? But what is Hogwarts, truly? Is it the stone and magic, the towers and dungeons, the enchantments layered over centuries? Is it the institution, the curriculum, the system of houses and points and Quidditch matches? Or is it something less tangible, something that persists regardless of physical damage or administrative changes? I would argue, and you would do well to consider this carefully, that Hogwarts is memory. It is the accumulated experience of every witch and wizard who has walked these halls, every spell cast in these classrooms, every secret whispered in these corridors. The castle remembers everything, not consciously, perhaps, but the magic itself is a form of memory, events imprinting themselves on the fabric of the place. You can feel it if you pay attention. The great hall carries echoes of 1,000 years of conversations, arguments, celebrations, the everyday magic of children becoming adults. The library holds not merely books, but the traces of everyone who has studied there: desperation before exams, excitement at discoveries, the quiet satisfaction of understanding finally achieved. Even the dungeons, cold and dark as they are, carry warmth if you know where to look. Students practicing potions together, the satisfaction of perfect execution, friendships forged in shared frustration over particularly difficult brews. The castle is also contradiction. It is the place where Voldemort learned dark magic, and where Harry Potter learned to oppose him. It is where Dumbledore taught Tom Riddle, and where he later prepared Potter to destroy what Riddle became. It produced Death Eaters and members of the Order of the Phoenix, heroes and villains, the brilliant and the mediocre, It is simultaneously the safest place in magical Britain and a location that has witnessed extraordinary violence. This contradiction is not weakness, but strength. A school that produced only one type of student, that reinforced only one ideology, would be indoctrination rather than education. Hogwarts at its best, and it is not always at its best, teaches students to think, to question, to make their own choices. It provides tools and knowledge, but leaves application to individual conscience. This is dangerous, certainly. It allows for the possibility that students will make terrible choices, will use their education to harm rather than help. But the alternative tempting to control not merely what students learn, but what they becomes worse. That path leads to Umbridge's Hogwarts, to the Carrows' Hogwarts, to institutions that serve power rather than truth. The castle also endures because it adapts. It has survived 1,000 years, not by remaining static, but by changing with each generation. Medieval Hogwarts was not Renaissance Hogwarts, was not Victorian Hogwarts, is not modern Hogwarts. The core remains the commitment to magical education, the house system, the essential structure, but the specifics evolve. This is necessary. A school that cannot change cannot survive. Consider the Chamber of Secrets, that monument to Slytherin's paranoia and hatred. For centuries it remained hidden, a threat waiting to be realized. When it was finally opened, when the basilisk was released and students died, the horror could have destroyed the school's reputation permanently. Instead, the chamber was conquered, the basilisk slain, the threat neutralized. The chamber itself was sealed permanently, or as permanently as anything can be sealed in a castle that rearranges itself. The story became a lesson about the danger of unexamined prejudice, about courage in facing seemingly insurmountable threats, about the importance of friendship and loyalty in dark times. Or consider the Room of Requirement, destroyed in the Wunfer. For years after the battle, that loss was mourned a unique magical space, gone forever. But within a decade, students reported discovering it again, or something very much like it. The castle, it seemed, had regenerated what was destroyed, though the new room functioned somewhat differently than the old. It was less responsive to specific requests, more likely to provide what was needed rather than what was wanted. This distinction matters. The castle, through whatever consciousness it possesses, had learned from the war, had adapted its magic to prevent the room from being used for hoarding or hiding in the same ways. The Forbidden Forest, too, has changed. Once a place of genuine danger, where students ventured at their peril, it has been partially tamed, paths cleared and marked, the more dangerous creatures relocated to deeper sections. Centaurs still inhabit its depths, maintaining their isolation from the castle, but they occasionally permit classes to visit the forest's edge. Acromantulas, following Aragog's death, have departed for regions unknown. Thestrals remain, tended by those who can see them, no longer figures of horror but of melancholy beauty. Chapter 13. Mysteries that remain. Yet for all that has changed, Hogwarts retains its mysteries. Secret passages remain undiscovered. The Marauder's map, comprehensive as it was, did not capture everything. Rooms exist that appear on no map, accessible only to those who need them for reasons the castle deems sufficient. The full extent of the founder's magic woven into the structure remains unknown. Researchers have spent careers attempting to catalogue every enchantment, every protective ward, every spell that maintains the castle's function, and they have inevitably failed. There are magics here that predate the founders themselves, drawn from the land, from ley lines that intersect beneath the castle, from sources that contemporary wizards can barely comprehend. The Sorting Hat, too, remains enigmatic. It contains the knowledge and judgment of all four founders, yet it makes decisions that occasionally baffle everyone, placing students in houses that seem contrary to their natures. More than once, the hat has been wrong, or seemed to be wrong, though it insists it is never mistaken. Perhaps it sees potential rather than present character, sorting students not for what they are, but what they might become. Or perhaps it simply enjoys causing confusion. For an object imbued with personality, it possesses a remarkably dry sense of humor. The portraits that line the walls deserve mention as well. They are not merely paintings, but repositories of personality, capable of conversation and, to some extent, independent thought. The portraits of former headmasters and headmistresses are particularly sophisticated, serving as advisors to current administration, maintaining continuity across centuries. They argue among themselves, form alliances and rivalries, occasionally abandon their frames to visit other portraits throughout the castle. They are, in their way, as much a part of Hogwarts as the students themselves. And what of the future? What will Hogwarts become in the centuries ahead? Will the house system persist, or finally be abolished by a headmaster or headmistress, convinced it does more harm than good? Will the curriculum continue evolving toward greater integration with the Muggle world, or will there be a reactionary swing back toward traditional magical isolation? Will the castle itself endure, its enchantments maintained and renewed? Or will it finally succumb to the weight of centuries, crumbling back into the earth from which it was raised? These questions have no certain answers. Prophecy is an inexact art at best, and the future of institutions is determined by countless individual choices, by accidents and intentions intertwined too complexly to predict. What can be said is that Hogwarts has demonstrated remarkable resilience. It has survived the departure of a founder, witch hunts, internal conflicts, to major wars, occupation by forces that sought to corrupt its fundamental purpose. It has been damaged, sometimes severely, but never broken. That suggests a durability that transcends mere physical structure or legal institutions. Chapter 14. Conclusion. The Eternal School. So we return to where we began, to the question of what Hogwarts truly is. I have guided you through a millennium of history, from the founders' meeting in the 10th century to the transformed institution that exists today. You have witnessed its birth, its golden ages, its periods of darkness, its near destruction and subsequent renewal. You have seen how it has shaped the wizarding world, and been shaped by it in turn. Hogwarts is ultimately a collection of stories. The grand narrative of its founding, and the intimate stories of individual students discovering magic and themselves. The tragic tale of Slytherin's betrayal, and the triumphant account of Voldemort's defeat. The quiet story of a first year finally mastering a levitation charm, and the epic story of a bachelor Britain. All these stories are true. All are part of the castle's fabric. All contribute to what the place means. It is also a promise. When parents send their children here, they trust that those children will be educated, protected, transformed from ignorant youngsters into competent practitioners of magic. That promise has not always been kept perfect, lest students have died, been injured, been failed by the institution meant to shelter them. But the promise endures, renewed with each generation. Because the alternative world without Hogwarts, without systematic magical education, is too grim to contemplate. For you, listening to this in darkness, perhaps drifting toward sleep, Hogwarts may be memory or aspiration, history or fantasy, but for countless witches and wizards, it is home. Not merely the place where they lived for 7 years of their youth, but home in the deepest sense, the place that shaped who they are, where they discovered their abilities and their limitations, where they formed friendships that lasted lifetimes, where they first confronted genuine challenge and genuine darkness. The castle stands tonight as it has stood for 1,000 years, its towers silhouetted against the Scottish sky, its windows glowing with magical light, its halls echoing with the footsteps of students pursuing their own stories. Somewhere in those halls, a first year is lost, wandering corridors that shift and change, on the verge of panic before a helpful portrait points them in the right direction. In the library, a 7th year is studying desperately for NEWTs, convinced they will fail, not yet aware they will achieve exceeds expectations in every subject. In the Gryffindor common room, students are celebrating a Quidditch victory. In the Slytherin dungeons, others are plotting revenge. In Ravenclaw Tower, a philosophical debate has extended well past curfew. In the Hufflepuff common room, someone is baking contraband cookies, filling the air with the smell of chocolate and friendship. The castle contains all of this and more, infinite variations on the theme of magical adolescence, students becoming who they will be. It has witnessed this transformation for a millennium. It will, if we are fortunate, witness it for a millennium more. The magic endures, the stories continue, and somewhere in those ancient stones, something that might be consciousness watches and remembers and, perhaps, takes satisfaction in the continuation of a dream first dreamed by 4 founders who could never have imagined what their school would become. Sleep now, if you will. Dream of towers and secrets, of magic and mystery, of a castle that exists somewhere between history and legend, real as stone and intangible as mist. And should you wake to find yourself uncertain whether Hogwarts exists, whether any of this history is more than fiction, consider this. Every story that survives long enough becomes true in its way. Hogwarts has survived 1,000 years. Whether it exists in Scotland or in imagination, whether its stones are physical or metaphorical, it endures. And that endurance, that persistence across centuries and across minds, is a magic deeper than any spell. It has always stood. It will always stand. This is the history of Hogwarts, told as completely as words permit in darkness, in the voice of one who walked its halls and knew its secrets and understood, perhaps better than most, that the greatest magic is not found in wands or potions, but in the simple, extraordinary fact that knowledge passes from one generation to the next, that students become teachers, that learning never ends. The history of Hogwarts is not complete. It is still being written, still unfolding, still surprising those who think they understand it. But for tonight, for this moment suspended between waking and sleep, this accounting is sufficient. Rest now. Dream of a castle on a hill, of magic that endures, of 1,000 years of stories layered like sediment into living stone. Dream, and in dreaming, become part of the story yourself. The castle stands. It endures, and that, ultimately, is all the magic required. The castle stands.